Good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining us. We're going to get started in just a minute with our webinar this morning. Good morning. Thank you to everyone for joining us. We're going to get started in just a minute. We like to give it a bit so that people can load into the system. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started this morning. Thank you for joining us. Good morning. I'm Kate Shanks. I'm Vice President of Public Affairs for the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce. Today, we are talking about Kentucky's situation related to unemployment and our workforce situation, as well as how we relate to the rest of the country. At the Kentucky Chamber, we continue to follow these numbers pretty closely month over month and trying to get a really good understanding and picture of how our economy is doing in terms of our workforce. And so we thought it would be really helpful this morning to bring in our speaker to talk us through these numbers and help us understand what they're telling us and what we need to be watching for over the coming months. Before I get started and introduce our speaker, I do want to thank our sponsor in this effort, the Kentucky Community and Technical College System. They're a really great partner and we really appreciate their engagement on so many different issues. This is part of our Restart Kentucky webinar series. This is something we started back in March to help businesses better understand what's happening with the pandemic and to educate business leaders and citizens on a variety of different issues. And we've had nearly 30 different webinars since then on the topic of COVID-19 and issues related to COVID-19. So if this is your first time joining us, welcome. It's great to have you as part of the discussion today. And if you're not already familiar, we do have a Restart Kentucky website. You can visit kychamber.com and click on the Restart Kentucky banner at the top of the page, and you'll find resources on Healthy at Work, Kentucky's reopening schedule, any changes there, any major announcements from the governor as it relates to our business community, and a recording of all of the webinars that we've had since this spring, in case you want to go back and look at some topics, lots of different topics that we have covered. So please be sure to visit kychamber.com and our Restart Kentucky page for more information. We will record this webinar today, so that's great news if you need to step away for a minute or if you want to revisit some part of the discussion. It will be recorded and it will be posted on that Restart page later today, as well as shared on the Kentucky Chamber social media channels. With that, I would like to introduce our speaker today. We are really thrilled to have Dr. Mike Clark, who is the Director of the Center for Business and Economic Research, an Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Kentucky Gatton College of Business and Economics. And he has I think a really informative presentation ready for us this morning that he's going to be walking us through. And as he's presenting, if you do have questions, please feel free to click the chat box at the bottom of the screen and you can submit your question to me, and I'll reserve some time back at the end for us to do a little Q&A as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Clark and we will get started.
Well, good morning. Really thrilled to be here today. Let me take a moment to make sure I can get my presentation up. It's always kind of that awkward point of hoping that the technology works the way you think it will, and me not being very good at some of these things. So, okay, it looks like it's up, so let's go ahead and get started. All right, so let me give you kind of a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today. First, we're going to really talk about how the economic downturn has affected Kentucky. And we're really going to compare this to the US. And I think it's really important for us to do that because as the pandemic has progressed from kind of those initial stages to where we are now, there's been a lot of information out there where we've been trying to understand how Kentucky has been affected relative to the nation. And depending on what data you use and what maybe media you've been looking at, you might have heard different things. For example, at the beginning of the pandemic, one of the first statistics that started coming out was related to in the initial claims for unemployment insurance. And there are several reports suggesting that Kentucky was one of the hardest hit states. As we progressed, we saw unemployment rates really jump up, and then around June, Kentucky had the lowest unemployment rate in the nation, suggesting to some that maybe Kentucky had actually recovered and that we were really doing well. And the truth of the matter is probably those are kind of extreme situations. And I think what I'm going to be able to do here is maybe show you a little bit better way of understanding some of the data, some of the limitations associated with it. And I'm going to show you that Kentucky has been affected in a very similar way as the rest of the nation. Certainly there are some things that are unique for Kentucky, but in terms of the aggregate impacts, we've been affected in a very similar way as the rest of the nation. We'll also look at how Kentucky's major industries have been affected. And then we'll talk a little bit about how the recovery is progressing and what we can maybe kind of expect or look for. Now, I've got to kind of put a couple of blanket caveats out here. And this applies throughout the entire presentation. Every slide that I'm going to show you, a couple of things that I want you to really understand is that the most recent economic data that we have, of course, is really important because it's giving us kind of that real-time effect or real-time indication of what's going on in the economy. But oftentimes that data is preliminary, and the most recent data tends to have the most noise in it. So that data tends to get revised, and so we always have to kind of understand that there's some limitations associated with some of that initial data. And the second, and this is really important, is that this situation, even though we're months into this, continues to evolve, and it evolves very quickly. So as we're going through talking about maybe how the recovery is progressing and where we can maybe expect to be, in a few months or a year, one of the things that's really plagued us throughout this recession is that the situation evolves very quickly. There's a lot of uncertainty. And so this has been a problem for economic forecasters. And as a result, a lot of the forecasts that have been provided throughout this period is really having a fairly short shelf life. As new data comes in, those forecasts are having to be revised to incorporate new information that we're learning about how the pandemic is progressing. Okay, one of the first measures that economists really like to look at when they talk about the economy is GDP, gross domestic product. So here I'm showing you US real GDP, and GDP is basically the value of the goods and services that the economy is producing. So it's a really broad indicator of what we're doing in our economy. And when I talk about real GDP, all we're basically saying is that we remove the effect of inflation from this so that we can really see how that value is changing absent price changes. And what you can see is that here we're showing the percent change from quarter to quarter. We're showing it at an annual rate. And so kind of the headline that you've probably seen is regarding second quarter GDP, and that it declined about 32% in the second quarter, which is kind of a phenomenal decline. One thing to keep in mind, though, I think there's been a lot of confusion about this rate. So economists like to talk about these at an annual rate, and they do that because it makes it easier to compare from quarter to quarter and across years. But that's not the way most people normally think about that. That doesn't mean that we lost close to a third of our economy. Really, if you look at the way I think most people look at it in terms of percent change from one quarter to the next quarter, what happened is that we saw about a 9% decline in real GDP. Now that's still very, very large. That's a very large change. And if you go back and you compare that to the prior recession, you see that it's a much larger decrease than what we saw in any quarter in the Great Recession. Now, the other measure we like to look at are measures of what's going on in the labor market. And part of the reason we like to look at this is because we get a lot of fairly current data on a regular basis, both monthly and weekly. So here I want to start with Kentucky's weekly unemployment claims. And of course, claims are really important because they're a leading indicator of what's going on in the economy. And it's one of the first things we see start to change. And so, okay, here are our recessions and here are our initial claims. And so what you can see is that our initial unemployment claims really spiked around March and April. And then they start to taper off. But they still remain relatively high. And if you look at how that compares to the Great Recession, again, it was very sudden and a very strong increase in initial claims. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, one of the first things that people started reporting about was initial claims. And if you look at initial claims for Kentucky relative to the labor force, and you compare that to other states, it looks like we are one of the highest hit, or hardest hit states in the nation. But initial claims, you got to remember how this process works. Basically, what happens is there's an initial claim, and then it has to go through the review process through the state. And then what happens is the state determines whether or not that was an actual claim. Did that individual really qualify for unemployment benefits? Did they really lose their job? And then if upon that review, it's determined that they do qualify for benefits, then they start getting those payments, and then they're able to continue to file unemployment claims. So initial claims is kind of this flow of people into the unemployment insurance system or the benefits. Continued claims is more this stock of how many people are actually there. Now, initial claims really seemed high, but if you look at how those initial claims were kind of accumulating, if you kind of summed up those, what was happening is that they seemed to be, really high in Kentucky, but they didn't really translate into continuing claims that really, there were large amounts of continuing claims, but not as much as might be implied by the number of initial claims that we received. So continued claims, again, that's kind of that stock. They spiked too, and they've started to come down. But continued claims never really got to as high as where the initial claims might have suggested. And that was the, kind of what was going on in one of those initial reports suggesting that Kentucky was one of the hardest hit claims or states. Initial claims seem to imply that that was the case. But when you look at continued claims, what you see is a somewhat different story. So we have to be a little bit careful about looking at initial claims, because many of those claims may not really represent individuals who have lost their jobs. And continued claims is potentially a better indicator, in my opinion. So let's look at how continued claims have changed in Kentucky relative to the rest of the nation. So here what we're seeing is continued claims divided by the number of workers who are covered by unemployment insurance. And we do this so that we can compare different areas, such as the state to the nation. And you can see how continued claims changed for Kentucky and how they can claim, or they changed for the US. And what you see is that they jumped up again, very quickly. They reached very high levels, but the level for Kentucky was fairly similar to the rest of the nation. And of course, they've started to decline, and Kentucky has been declining a little bit faster than the rest of the nation. Now, I kind of, had some concerns about initial claims. We have to be a little bit concerned about interpreting continued claims as well, because again, there's a backlog of claims still. That backlog of claims may not be showing up in some of the continued claims data. So we have to be a little bit careful of that. As that backlog gets caught up, we may see that some of those continued claims numbers will start to increase. But given what continued claims look like right now, the data seems to be suggesting that Kentucky is actually experiencing a fairly similar effect from the pandemic as what the rest of the nation is. Okay, let's look at weekly claims by some of the sectors to see what was going on with those. And I'm only going to show 4 sectors here. These were some of those that were the most hardest hit. And of course, manufacturing, jumped very quickly and then started to recover. And kind of the story here is basically that manufacturers, a lot of them were basically choosing to suspend their operations for a period of time in an attempt to curb the spread of the virus. They were later able to reopen, maybe not to full capacity, but they were able to bring back some of their workers. And so you started to see at the initial closing that some workers were able to apply for unemployment insurance benefits, but then those started to decline very quickly as many of those workers started to go back to work. Well, we started to see it's kind of the same type of thing in the other sectors. For example, the healthcare sector, we saw the same thing. Out of concern of spreading the virus, a lot of the healthcare businesses, particularly physician's office, dental offices, started to close down or reduce their operations in an attempt to reduce the potential to spread the virus. Again, a lot of those businesses have started to reopen, and so we're seeing claims from those sectors decline. 2 of the hardest hit areas are accommodation and food services and the retail trade. Of course, same type of story. There were very significant increases in claims from those sectors, largely because those were sectors where there's a lot of personal contact and there were concerns of spreading the virus. Okay, I was talking earlier about continued claims, and if you were looking closely at some of the headings, I had this insured unemployment rate, and that's not the unemployment rate we normally see in the headlines. This one is. So here I'm showing you kind of the headline unemployment rate. This is what we normally see being published every month, and we're seeing Kentucky in the U.S. And you can see kind of over this long period that Kentucky's unemployment rate tends to track generally fairly well with the nation's. Generally, we tend to have a somewhat higher unemployment rate than the rest of the country. Both were hit very hard by the pandemic, spiked, and then started to come down. And I want to focus on this area here in the past few months, and I'm going to zoom in on this in just a moment. But if you'll notice kind of what's going on here is that both Kentucky and the US saw this spike fairly early, around April, in the unemployment rate. And then it started to decline. But if you'll notice what happened with Kentucky around June, Kentucky's unemployment rate declined to a point where it's much lower than the rest of the nation. And in June, we actually had the lowest official unemployment rate in the nation. And it got back down to about 4.4%, which was the same level prior to the pandemic. So they had a lot of people kind of scratching their heads. Some were looking at it thinking, well, maybe this suggests that we've actually recovered. And there have been some media reports suggesting that, certain communities, that was the case. For example, there were some reports about Owensboro having a really low unemployment rate and essentially having a speedy recovery. But I think there's more going on here. And I think it's important for us to understand what was causing that unemployment rate to decline. So let's talk for a moment about how that unemployment rate is determined, and we'll get a better sense of how to read that unemployment rate. Now, the unemployment rate comes from a survey of households. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, or the BLS, basically contact households and ask about several questions about the employment situation of the residents of the household. And from these questions, workers are classified into three groups, or individuals are classified into three groups. We have the employed, and these are people who work for pay. We have the unemployed, and these are individuals who weren't working, but they were actively searching for work during the past 4 weeks. And the search requirement, or this search effort, is really important in terms of defining whether they're unemployed or not. Now, search activity can be applying for a job, it can be going to interviews, but there has to be some search effort during the past 4 weeks to be officially categorized as unemployed. These two groups make up our labor force. Now, the third group are people who are not in the labor force. And these are people who are not employed and they're not searching for work. And this can encompass people in a lot of different situations. This can include students who are focusing on their studies and therefore not looking for work. This can include retirees who, again, are not looking for work. But it can also include individuals who maybe had worked last month but lost their job, but for whatever reason are choosing not to search for work right now. And this could be because they hope to be called back from their employer. It could be that right now they just think this is a really bad time to work, and they're not required now, since the search requirement has been waived for unemployment benefits, they're not required to search for work. So when we look at the unemployment rate, or we calculate the unemployment rate, it's calculated by dividing the number of people who are unemployed by the number of people who are in the labor force. And you'll notice that people who are not in the labor force, even if they want to be employed, are not included in this unemployment rate. So what's going on in terms of Kentucky's low unemployment rate? Well, here we have Kentucky's low or unemployment rate for the past few months. And you can see that prior to the pandemic, it was running around a little over 4%. Jumped up to about 16.6, I think, in April, and then it started to fall. And in June and July, it was down around 4.4 again, pre-pandemic levels. So what was going on? Did people go back to work to the same levels, or was there some other story? So here we're looking at employment, and we see again that employment was pretty high, close to 2 million people working in January and February. Fell substantially in April, started to come back, and in June, there were quite a few workers coming back, but we still weren't up anywhere near the 2 million mark in June. So the unemployment rate didn't go down because we saw a substantial number of workers, to the same level prior to the pandemic, going back to their jobs. We did see some employment increases, but not pre-pandemic levels. What happened was the labor force seemed to be going down. Again, workers were not searching for jobs. They may be without work, but at the moment they're not searching for jobs. And so what has happened is they essentially are classified as not being in the labor force. So the labor force number has gone down. So the unemployment rate didn't go down simply because so many workers went back to work. It went down because a lot of these individuals are actually out of the labor force at the moment. So given that, what's a better way for us to think about how Kentucky has been changing? Well, one of the numbers that I like to look at is the employment to population ratio. This measures the percentage of the population aged 16 and over who are employed. And so what you can see here is what the employment to population ratios were for Kentucky and the US. So Kentucky's in blue, orange is the US. And you see in February, just prior to the pandemic, about 57% of the population was working. This, of course, went down by April, and it's come back up some, but even by August, we were still down 4 percentage points from where we were prior to the pandemic. So we've improved, but we're not back to pre-pandemic levels. The nation has seen a very similar type of response. They were around a little over 61% prior to the pandemic. They're down a few percentage points at about 56.5%. And the effect in both the nation and Kentucky has been fairly similar. So again, this other statistic seems to be telling us that we're experiencing a fairly similar type of effect here in Kentucky as what we're experiencing in the rest of the nation. Okay, so I talked about a lot of people who seem to be leaving the labor force or essentially not searching for work. And I wanted to look at this a little bit more detail. So here I'm showing the percentage or the labor force participation rate by gender for those who are kind of those prime working ages, age 25 to 54. So these numbers are basically showing what, how this labor force has changed across different groups. And you can see both for males and females that it declined fairly quickly and kind of bounced up. But we're starting to notice some differences here in the last few months that are potentially a concern. The female labor force participation rate has actually been improving. But what we're seeing over the last few months suggests that the labor force participation rate for women have started to decline a bit more, and there's some separation in terms of the rates across gender. So when we look at why this is occurring, a lot of it has to do with the fact that workers are reporting that there aren't jobs out there. But one of the things that we're seeing is childcare seems to be an issue, and we're seeing a lot more both males and females reporting that childcare commitments are arranging for childcare has been a limiting factor in terms of their ability to go back and get into the labor force and look for work. But we're seeing that more pronounced in terms of women. When we look across race, and here I'm looking at age 16 and over, and I should have mentioned, these numbers are actually for the US, not specifically for Kentucky. We're seeing, again, differences in terms of the labor force participation rates across different races. If you look at whites, blacks, and Asians, again, you see that they were all hit fairly early in the recession. But if you'll notice the difference between whites and blacks prior to the pandemic, there was a difference, but it was fairly narrow. That gap has been growing here in the past few months. So we're seeing both blacks and whites going back to work, but that gap in the labor force participation rate across race seems to be growing. Okay, so another statistic we like to look at, this is another measure of the labor market, employment. While the unemployment rate and those numbers I was discussing before largely come from surveys of households, we also survey businesses, or the Bureau of Labor Statistics surveys businesses, and they ask about the number of jobs that they have. So here we're looking at Kentucky's non-farm employment. And again, you can see just how severe the downturn was and how sudden it was. We lost a lot more jobs in the early parts of the recession than what we saw during the Great Recession. We're seeing a lot of those jobs come back fairly quickly as a lot of the social distancing orders were lifted. Businesses started to come back, and we've recovered about 62% of the jobs that we had lost in the first couple of months of the pandemic. But we're still far below where we were prior to the pandemic. How are we comparing relative to the nation? Well, in this chart, what I'm basically showing is how we have changed relative to where we were in January. So what I'm basically saying is, at any given month, where do we stand relative to where we were in January for both Kentucky and the US? And so, again, you see in April, we had lost more than 16% of the jobs relative to where we were in January. We have recovered a lot of those jobs. But even in August, we were still down about 6.3%, I believe, relative to where we were in January. Nationally, we see the same story. And in August, the US employment numbers were still down about, I think it was 7.3% relative to where they were in January. So again, we see some differences in the magnitude, but generally not very large differences, seeing a very similar pattern. All right, so let's take a look at the different industries and how that has progressed. So what we're seeing is employment changes from January to August. Again, the difference is about 6.3% relative to where we were. And a lot of those job losses were in three major sectors: professional business services, which includes a broad group, includes accountants, engineers, actuaries, but it also includes temporary workers as well. Leisure and hospitality and retail trade, again, not too surprising that we were losing workers there. The only sector where we saw increases from January to August was construction. And so construction seems to have actually held up, although they had some losses in the early months. They've actually seen some slight employment gains. Let's look at some of the timelines associated with these. So again, and how we also compare relative to the nation. So again, construction seems to have has the same roughly the same number of workers, even slightly more than what we saw in January. And Kentucky's construction sector seems to be doing a bit better than the rest of the nation. Manufacturing, again, sudden drops in April with some recovery after that, but we're still down about 5%. For trade, that's been fairly similar for Kentucky and the nation. And I won't go into each one of these because of the amount of time, but they'll be available for you to look at later. Again, financial activities and professional business services were areas where we saw a lot of declines, and we seem to be recovering more slowly than the rest of the nation. Healthcare services, again, we saw some pretty substantial losses. Employment in hospitals seems to have largely come back, although hospitals financially are probably not doing as well as they were prior to the pandemic. Employment levels have come back. Many of the doctor's office and dental offices that had suffered pretty significant employment losses have come back, but are still fairly low relative to where they were prior to the pandemic. We see the same type of story as we look across some of our major MSAs. Same pattern, slight differences in the estimates, but similar story. Consumer sentiment. So consumer sentiment is one of the things that we're going to really have to watch going forward. Consumer sentiment still is low, and so that's something that's going to be a concern as we are looking to recover. So what does recovery look like? Well, again, let me reiterate that there's a lot of uncertainty here. These are some forecasts that were provided by the Congressional Budget Office, and what they basically show is that after the initial decline, we start seeing some large increases, but those increases really taper off, and it's likely that we will experience fairly slow growth over the continuing quarters, and that we won't really be back to where we were for some time. So for GDP, what they're projecting is that we really wouldn't be back to where pre-pandemic levels until sometime in 2022. For employment, they were projecting that it would actually take longer. And again, these are going to be continually revised as more information comes in about the path of the virus and the policy response to that path. So one thing to remember is that the downturn was really a policy choice to address the public health threat. As we look to continue the recovery, that recovery is going to be determined by two primary things: the progression of the virus and the continuing easing of social distancing policies. If a second wave hits, and if it requires, doing the social distancing orders again, then we start to see that recovery suffer. Consumer confidence is going to be an issue going forward. Even though we might start to get a handle on the virus, consumers need to be confident that that's going to be the case, that they're going to be safe going about their usual pre-pandemic routines. And of course, federal stimulus is going to be potentially play a role here. The previous stimulus does seem to have helped propped up the economy. Certainly there are, there have been some concerns regarding, some of the stimulus and how that maybe sometimes that has been distributed. But generally as a package, the federal stimulus seems to have been helpful in propping up the economy. But the path of the recovery is really highly uncertain and is going to incorporate this balancing of the reopening with the containment of the virus. So looking forward, we do have some challenges, largely in terms of a limited childcare. Businesses are suffering in terms of disruptions to their supply chains and their operations. And they're also faced with reduced and uncertain demand for the goods and services that they produce. And as the economy takes longer to reopen, the damage becomes more significant and more difficult to repair. Temporary closures become permanent, and those permanent closures are much harder to recover from. So in terms of what to watch for, again, the data that I've talked about here are kind of the main things. Even though there's some concerns about, you have to be careful about interpreting some of the data because there's always noise there and you got to be careful about interpreting that. Initial claims have tapered off, but we would want to kind of watch those to see whether or not they could increase in the absence of additional stimulus. That could tell us kind of what's going on here in the next couple of months. Continued claims we would expect to continue to decline, but they could decline, in the short run, partially because workers are returning to work, or in the long run, workers will start to exhaust their benefits, and so they would kind of start to come out of these continued claims for that reason. So we have to watch what is driving those continuing claims to change. Additional information, it comes out monthly, both from the national and from state sources. You can find the employment reports at KY Center for Statistics. And again, I would focus on changes in employment rather than the unemployment rate, largely because of the concerns that I've showed you here today. Unemployed workers who are not searching for work are not counted in the unemployment rate. And we can actually see the economy improving, and workers who are maybe on the sideline, not participating in the labor force, could, as they see that economy improve, start to want to get back in the labor force again. And we can actually see the unemployment rate go up as they come off the sidelines and start searching for work. And this is not necessarily a bad thing because they're responding to an improving economy. So I've talked for a really long time. That really concludes my comments, and I'd be happy to turn back over to you, Kate.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. That was really helpful and I think interesting to cover. And I think your last point that increasing unemployment rate actually could be a sign of things improving as people come back into the labor force and start looking for work. And I think that's an important piece to point out. So I'm glad you got to that. And, we look closely at those employment numbers too, month over month. And are people working more? And are they coming back into the labor force by looking for work versus just straight up looking at the unemployment rate, which I think you have to be very careful with that rate and what it tells you. So we do have some questions. One from the chat. This is from earlier in the presentation. Does IUR include claims of people covered through PUA? And you'll probably need to maybe define those terms. I think they're talking about those that are not normally eligible, right, for unemployment insurance.
Right. That's a good question. I need to actually look into that and make sure I understand exactly how those are being counted. So I don't think I want to answer. I don't think I can answer that question today. Sorry. I'll try to
Yeah,
follow up.
and I did, there's actually an article in one of our local papers about that particular case, that some states some state claim numbers could include those PUA folks that could be inflating those numbers. As you come into the state system first, you're not deemed eligible for that, but you are deemed eligible under the CARES or FFCR, one of the federal stimulus programs. So that's a good question. I think we should, maybe look into that at the state level.
And one thing to think about in terms of interpreting that, as long as it's done consistently, from month to month,
Yeah.
then that's probably okay. But if that starts to change in terms of the reporting, then we would have a big concern. And it also means that we need to be careful about comparing these claims to claims prior to the pandemic where they wouldn't have been available. So that could exaggerate the difference between this recession and the past recession. So we have to be careful about interpreting that.
And I have a couple other questions, and I do remind everybody, if you have a question, please type it into the chat. That's the best way to get your question answered. In the beginning of your presentation, we looked at some of the numbers from the Great Recession, and this is just interesting to me. It seems like a very different picture today than what we experienced during the Great Recession, yet we all have the memory of the Great Recession. Is the situation we're dealing with now, does it make it difficult to compare us to that time period? Just the fact that it hit fast, that it was based on sudden need to close to stop the spread. Does that kind of make it tricky to look into the future and do any forecasts based on what we learned from the Great Recession?
It does. So forecasting is really, really challenging at this point. So we like to look at history to inform the future. And how that recovery occurred is one of the first things that people started doing is, what can we learn from the past recession to inform this one? But this is really a different situation, because last one, it was an issue of the economy dealing with issues in maybe the financial market and the housing market. Whereas this one, it was really a policy choice, across the nation. It was a policy choice to address a public health threat. And so the issue here in terms of recovery is, when does that public health threat go away? And there's so much uncertainty about when that public health threat goes away that it's really challenging for us to forecast when the economy comes back. Even if we don't have shutdown orders or guidance to shut down even, there's still an issue in terms of when will people feel safe to go back? So consumer confidence is going to recover in a much different way than it did in the past, largely because this is a public health issue as opposed to, a more traditional economic problem.
Right, great. And then looking at some of your slides that look at the different sectors of our economy, is there anything unique about Kentucky's economy that makes us more or less resilient in this situation? I know during the Great Recession, it was maybe not so much that we lost jobs as quickly as other states did. We were kind of able to hang on, but strong manufacturing, strong logistics, of course, the sectors hit hard in all states, hit hard here. Any thoughts about our economy and how we would be able to rebound?
Well, I think some of the initial issues that we faced had to do with, we are a large manufacturing state. And we saw a lot of our manufacturers feel the need to shut down in the early days because manufacturing is one of those. It's not like a lot of the financial sectors or other sectors where maybe you can have remote work. Manufacturing, that's a much more challenging thing. And so, I think one of the issues is manufacturers maybe had to go through and figure out how to change their operations in order to help their workers. But I think, since we're a large manufacturing state, the ability for us to adapt those operations is one of the challenges that I think we really have. And I think, again, we do have a strong manufacturing base. There still seems to be a fair amount of demand, although some of that demand is uncertain and some of that has gone down, particularly as airline travel has gone down.
Yeah, and I do have a couple more questions, and then a comment from Michael Jones that IUR does not include PUA or PEUC. So just an update from one of our attendees. Here's a question. We are a large manufacturing employer in Bowling Green. This area has a significant amount of unfilled positions due to lack of applicants. I feel the unemployment number is lower than advertised. Is this happening across the state, nation? I think this is a good point. You know, we have a Who's Hiring campaign right now that has 90,000 jobs in it in Kentucky. So there are jobs open in Kentucky. And then when you talk about our labor force situation, you know, people aren't looking for work right now, possibly due to childcare and not, you know, the issues happening with women. I mean, this is a tricky situation for us. We have to get our workers back. So any thoughts on, you know, the unemployment number lower than advertised? Is this happening across the state or nation?
Yeah, I think, you know, when you see that 4.4% unemployment rate that we saw in June and July, you know, that really doesn't reflect the situation in the labor market. Again, I think we have a lot of workers who maybe are out there, maybe sitting on the sidelines. Now, you know, again, there's been the search requirement has been waived. So, you know, they may feel that they don't need to go back to work as long as, you know, they're able to keep unemployment benefits. So that could be one thing that's affecting people not applying for these jobs. But yes, I think, you know, we've got to be a little bit careful about interpreting that low unemployment number. And there are, you know, a fair amount of jobs. It's just really a question of, well, how do we get people, again, back into those types of jobs?
Right. It's certainly something we're watching. A couple more questions here. As more job losses become permanent and UI benefits expire, do you think this recession will shift into more of a traditional recession as opposed to the public health induced recession because consumer spending will probably decline?
It could. So, you know, a lot of the stimulus, a lot of the policy that had been put in place was really to try to prop up the economy until the public health threat had passed. The concern there was that, you know, we would start to see, again, these workers separate from these jobs, and then it might, you know, these businesses start to go out of business permanently. It would be harder for those workers to find jobs. And so then we might start to see kind of the same issues we have in others, is how do you get, you know, consumers back when, you know, they're looking at uncertain prospects for employment, reduced incomes. So yes, I think, you know, we could potentially see that the longer this drags out.
And then one last question, I think this one's going to be harder to answer, but after the extension from 26 weeks to 39 weeks, so there's been an extension in the unemployment insurance benefits. Traditionally, it's 26 weeks. After that's exhausted, in your opinion, what time frame do you think we might see a decision on a second extension? So that would come at the federal level, correct? I mean, so basically this is a question about, you know, when might Congress take another action related to this, correct?
I don't think I can answer that.
I don't think any of us can answer that right now. That is certainly something that we have engaged on at the Kentucky Chamber with our congressional delegation to talk about, specifically unemployment insurance. We actually have one more question that just came in. You know, you have an economist sitting here and people are just going to hit you up with all kinds of questions. So is there any data that indicates how many of those out of work but not seeking work may return to work, and when? Is it likely that that many of those are permanently out of the workforce? I do have this question. Does BLS track the reason why? I mean, that's where you pulled out some of the childcare concerns, right? So, you know, maybe you could infer that if you address that reason, they're coming back.
Right. You know, I think, you know, we saw this, you know, I can't remember exactly what time, but, you know, after the Great Recession, we saw a lot of people when the UI benefits ran out, they left the labor force. You know, presumably they no longer had to search for work. So, you know, when their benefits ran out, so they went out of the labor force. And it wasn't until we started seeing the economy come back, you know, really stronger, that they started coming off the sidelines. I think in this case, you know, we do have some data from the BLS. It's harder to infer at the state level because the sample sizes are really small, but at the national level, one of the things that we're seeing is we're seeing a lot more workers or individuals indicate that they're not in the labor force because of retirement. So, you know, you can kind of envision that, you know, maybe we had people who were close to retirement, that, they see that maybe they've lost their job, and so they're just choosing to retire. And that doesn't mean they wouldn't come back, if situations change. So we're seeing some of that. A lot of them are basically saying, well, it looks like there's just not work right now. And again, as the economy starts to pick back up, we could start to see them come back as well. It's harder to really predict when that would happen. Again, that is going to go back to how the economy recovers. When do we really put the public health threat behind us? And then we could start to see that, the economy pick up and these workers start to have, feel that the prospect for finding a job has improved, and so they would come back into the labor force.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Clark. And I just want to let everyone know at the Kentucky Chamber, we're going to be following these numbers and, of course, our recovery from the pandemic recession. I don't know if it's been titled yet. I know we had the Great Recession. I don't know what we're calling this past one, but that we will be following our recovery from this. Our 2020 legislative agenda will be focused on recovery, economic recovery, and also doing what we can to help stop the spread of the virus, which the business community has been heavily engaged in since March. So we will continue to track this and work to get our workers back as quickly as possible and try to do all we can to stop the spread of the virus so that we can continue to bounce back to where we were before the pandemic, which was in a pretty good state in terms of our employment and our production in Kentucky. So we will be committed to that at the Kentucky Chamber. But thank you to everyone for joining us today, and thank you to our speaker. Maybe we can have you back and check in a couple of months, a few months, and see where we're at and continue the conversation. We will have future discussions on the pandemic and the business community's response and how we can be more engaged. So please follow us on social media at the Kentucky Chamber, various social media pages, so that you can keep track of our discussions through the Restart Kentucky webinar series. And again, this has been recorded and we will be posting it on social media as well as on the Restart Kentucky website at kychamber.com. So thank you, and everyone have a great day.